makes for a good story? I feel like I've been asking that question my entire life. I was one of those kids that just devoured books. I think I learned so much about myself and the world around me, not from necessarily other people, but from great literature. And so today I'm a documentary filmmaker, and in a lot of ways I think that's the job I was born to do. You know, to use a story term to define it, I'm Nick to Gatsby. I'm the next door neighbor to the big story. It's not my story. In fact, if it were up to me, I would not be on this stage, I'd be behind it. Part of the reason I tell you that I have that discomfort with the idea of being the big story, particularly in an age of reality TV where everyone wants to be a star, is because I know the impact of the big story on people's lives. I'm the daughter and granddaughter of big history. My mother is a child Holocaust survivor. She was born in Katowice, Poland, and was a toddler when the war broke out, World War II. In our family, it's always the war, no adjectives needed. The toll it took on us is truly beyond comprehension. From what I hear from their stories, we had a huge extended family, aunts and uncles and cousins, and almost all of them perished in concentration camps. The reason I'm here today and that some of our family survived are because of the actions of one of the bravest women I've ever known, my grandmother. She founded an escape route, and those who decided to take the risk and sneak over the lines where Jews were corralled in the Warsaw Ghetto survived. Several members of my family, including my mother and my uncle, my great aunt, and a number of other Jewish people who decided to follow her path, lived. When I hear myself describe those actions to you, when I hear myself tell you her bravery, it's almost as if I'm describing a Hollywood war epic, that I'm pitching a screenplay. And I have often thought she's a pretty stubborn woman too. She was difficult in the peace times. And so I always sort of pictured her played by Katharine Hepburn. She's that kind of person. So, you have this strong character, and they triumph over adversity, and there's a happiness, even though there's a wake of tragedy behind them. But I understand that there's more to that story than just the triumph. Because, of course, I grew up with my mother, whose childhood was marked by that kind of fear and loss and anxiety. Can you imagine if you were a little girl, having to walk through the forest at night and evade gunmen? When you were hungry, you were told to gather up nuts off the forest floor and eat those? Can you imagine finding shelter on the front lines with a Russian army regiment, as the house you're in is being rocked from side to side from shelling? Those kinds of things stay with you. But I have to confess, that's not the mother I knew growing up in Birmingham, Alabama. She really tried to hide that. It's only as an adult I've heard more details of what her young years were like. She took me to piano lessons, she took me to Girl Scouts, just like any other suburban American mom. Yeah, she has this crazy accent, and if I were to do it for you, you wouldn't even believe it. And she had an embarrassing tendency on carpool days when it was cold to wrap a scarf around her head like a babushka. But, for the most part, she really tried to fit in. I had inklings. There was anxiety on her part whenever anything came on the news. In the 1970s, when images of the Cambodian genocide were being broadcast, she made sure my eyes were covered. She didn't want me to know about such suffering in the world. She wanted to protect me from that. But it sneaks in. The war hovered over my family. And I certainly knew when we went to go visit my grandparents in Montreal. There's quite a large exiled Jewish community in Montreal. And my grandparents' friends would come over, and over tea and cakes, they would talk about the old days and the old country. And even though I didn't understand a word, they were speaking in Polish. I felt this incredible heaviness and burden from what they were saying. And my mom tells me that as a young person, I'm sort of embarrassed to admit this, that I would go up to them and I would stamp my foot and say, "Speak English." And And presumably what I wanted them was to talk about stories of the here and now that were happy. Because those stories of the past, even though for them, that conjured up a lost world that they can't live in anymore. It only exists in stories. For me, it represented something that was going to hold me back. That the past that was so tragic was going to keep me from some sort of happy, successful future. It wasn't until many years later when I was working on a film in New York, interviewing the great literary master Albert Murray, also from Alabama, and that I began to understand something about my teenage yearning. Because you see, when I was in the Birmingham suburbs, predominantly white suburbs in the 1980s, it wasn't just my family's past I was trying to run away from, but my cities as well. I mean, in those teenage years, we really aren't always that content being Nick to Gatsby. I certainly wanted to be Gatsby. I wanted to be at the center of things. I wanted to be where things were happening. And Birmingham, to me, from that teenage perspective, were places where things were definitely not happening. But he allowed me to get over some of that shame and understand stories and my own story in a new way.
I always thought of myself in terms of books. And I thought of myself as a fairy tale hero that, like a prince in exile or something like that, undiscovered, somehow would come, I mean, that's the great story. You see, to me, basic equipment for living. Your whole conception of identity and all that comes from these stories. And you said, I'm going to be this one. I'm going to be that one. That's me. I can identify with it. I want to do that too. There's still a little you in there trying to get out. It's that interaction. And you get with kindred spirits. Like Ellison and I were kindred spirits. You got to deal with Joyce and Mann and Proust and Faulkner. It just makes me more Alabama to know Proust, because he's being thoroughly French. So you can learn from him that you're supposed to be where you are.
That was so powerful to me. Even though a huge chasm exists between our experience, Albert Murray comes from outside of Mobile, grew up under Jim Crow segregation and in poverty at the early 20th century, such a huge gulf of our experience, but it really taught me something about stories. Stories are the basic equipment for living. Stories allow us to express not only our innermost selves, but they also allow us to imaginatively leap over all sorts of different barriers of time and place and gender and class and race. We're able to see ourselves in these different roles. When he talks about that fairy tale hero, I understood something of that younger self, that urge to be able to transcend your circumstances. And I did have a fairy tale portion in my own life. I left Birmingham just as I dreamed and threatened I would as that teenager. I went to Harvard for college, which was an extraordinary experience. But I think that perhaps going to college itself is an extraordinary experience. It's where I took that nascent love of reading and of visual art and really learned how to think rigorously about them. It was the place where I learned how to make a film, and it was the place where I met my first boss and mentor in film, Spike Lee. After graduation, I went to work for Spike Lee's production company, 40 Acres and a Mule Filmworks, and my job literally was finding new stories for him to executive produce. I mean, dream job. And there I was, reading screenplays, going to plays, going to film festivals, student film screenings, reading unpublished manuscripts. My life was surrounded by stories. I got to work with writers closely that I'd only admired from afar. And so, if I think about that fairy tale, perhaps I'll sketch it in terms for my generation. If I were to sketch it out as a sitcom, it would probably be the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Girl with ambition in the city, she throws her hat in the air, you're gonna make it after all. It was exactly what I wanted, or so I thought. So, if you had told that girl that Spike Lee, one of the great American filmmakers and one of the great storytellers of New York stories, was going to inspire me to move back to Birmingham, Alabama, I would not have believed you, but that's exactly what happened. When Spike decided to produce a film about the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, he sent me back to my hometown to serve as his associate producer. And that film was an important film, not only because it was nominated for awards and has had this really great afterlife, but that film really changed the definition for me of what film can do. You know, earlier, that sort of more teenage version, that less developed version of film was a skill or an ability that allowed me to just reinvent myself, that Gatsby-esque reinvention. But all of a sudden, I understand there was a much deeper purpose to filmmaking. And I understood that that was to be able to facilitate that interaction between people who have a huge gulf of experience between them. You know, that film did a lot to be able to express to people about what the actual suffering and experience was like living under violently enforced segregation in Birmingham. I saw that firsthand, and it completely changed my career trajectory. I knew I didn't want to run away from the past and run away from Birmingham. Instead, I knew I wanted to turn my camera lens on it. I came back home, and I've been really lucky to work in a number of ways of telling my neighbors' stories. I worked on a film following 5 Birmingham women with breast cancer as they set out to prove what women can do after cancer, and I followed them on their climb of Mount Kilimanjaro. Currently, I'm working on a film about lesbian families in the Birmingham area in this year after the crucial, groundbreaking U.S. Supreme Court ruling permitting same-sex marriage. And I might add, in the same year that Alabama Supreme Court Justice Roy Moore is working to have a constitutional convention to forbid it. Perhaps, though, what I've learned the most about stories and the ways in which I've been able to really extend that camera lens to more and more neighbors is through my teaching at UAB. It's been one of the most profound experiences of my life. I direct the Media Studies program at UAB, and I have extraordinary students, undergraduates, learning how to use film and media to be able to tell crucial community stories. They are capturing community voices, and they're really sharing the issues they care about. And they don't shy away from tough questions. It's amazing to me what stories they pitch, things that I would never think of, and they're often ahead of the curve of the news cycle or willing to dig deeper. What happens to a company town when the company closes its doors? This film is about the coal mining community of Docena after the mines closed. One of my favorite early films, Benching: The Art of Watching Trains. This is a 2004 film that really celebrates the beauty of the railroad corridor before the rest of us discovered it. One of the things that I love about this film is that Tom Leader, the designer of our railroad park, has linked to this film from our archive because he says it so perfectly expresses what he was trying to capture in his design. I love that students did that. We have students that return again and again, year after year, to issues of transportation. And to me, I view this as a judgment each time they come in, bright-eyed, looking to solve the problem, because I know we adults have not. Whether we own cars, whether we can't afford cars, or can't drive a car, the transportation decisions and investments we make are going to determine the destiny of our community. And our students, our young people know this. Our students are so often more mature than I was at their age. They love being able to look to the past. We have films that celebrate so many of our great historic places, from the Oak Hill Cemetery to our theater district. The students want to find out, what does it take to preserve our great special places? They celebrate the religious diversity in our community, taking us out of the stereotype that we're just a Protestant town. They give voice to the poor. This amazing film about Jefferson County's pauper cemetery and the volunteer mourners who stand over these graves only marked by a coffee can filled with cement and a number. They tell stories about immigration, the experience and struggles of the people who come from all over to Birmingham. They showcase our natural beauty and oftentimes the struggle to preserve it. And they're up to the minute. We have films about the tornadoes and even small communities that you'd never think of, like those voluntary storm chasers who gave us advance warning. I've learned just an incredible amount about storytelling and what makes for a good story through my interaction with students. I realize that good stories very often contain contradictory elements. We have stories with main characters that are making forward progress. We love to watch that. The fairy tale hero, if you will. That's what they do. But we also love to understand something about their history, their culture, the nuance and detail of the world. It's pretty static. You know, we love that kind of tale of somebody triumphing over the status quo, being able to transcend his or her circumstances. But one of the questions that I have, what gets left behind after that triumphant rise? What is the rest of the story? Birmingham is having a fairy tale moment right now. I mean, it is exciting. We are building and growing and getting recognized nationally. I mean, things are definitely happening here. But one of the questions that I pose is, what kind of story are we making in our community? What kind of story do we want to tell? I think about the fairy tale. It has this important generative creative driver. That's what helps us imagine a rosy future, that happily ever after. That's what gives us that energy to make something where there is not anything. But I have to ask, is it inclusive? Does every one of our citizens get to participate in that rosy vision? I know from my own family history, the past endures. It makes its mark on the present day. And so one of the things that I love about the work I do at UAB is that we are trying to listen to our neighbors' stories and be able to take account of all these different experiences. But what I'd like to task you with today is that we need to turn these stories into action. We need to take these lessons and apply them and incorporate them into our actual plans and designs. If we do not, there are going to be far too many children in our community that have fairy tale aspirations but are never going to be able to fulfill their destiny. To me, the good story, the great story, it's not just the happy fairy tale story. It's the angry, fearful, hurt, crying story too. We need to listen to all of them so that we can understand truly who we were, who we are, and who we will be. Thank you.